history based on her German family's collection of letters and documents from the period 1933 to 45, and she studies the use of family history and microhistories of the Holocaust to evaluate the place of family history within the historiography of the Third Reich. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to our three speakers.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you, Ariana, and thank you, Peter, for joining me tonight to talk about your two books. They are remarkable in an almost haunting way and very, very moving. They're very honest, and there's a lot of personal detail of lived experience in them. And I was wondering, for the sake of our audience, if you could maybe start us off by giving us a brief summary of the content of your books, just so we start with some context, and then we'll go into.
Can you hear me? Great. So my book is incredibly personal, I suppose, and it didn't start off as a book, but a personal journey. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, I suppose, to begin with, and about where this came from. So I grew up in a Venezuela of the 70s and 80s, very different from the Venezuela now, which was full of color and potential. And more than anything in the world, I just wanted to be a detective. I wanted to solve mysteries. And little did I know that the biggest mystery would be that of my father. So by the time I was born, my father was 50. He had become a very successful industrialist, miles away from a sort of penniless refugee. Knew about my father before I came along. I remember someone saying the phrase, he was escaping a broken Europe and communism. But really what he'd left behind in Czechoslovakia was a complete mystery. And then playing detective, as one does when you're 9, I found a strange box, and it contained a series of old papers, and amongst them was an ID card. And it was an ID card with a photograph of my father, much younger than he was when I was there. But I had no doubt that it was him, it was his eyes. And there was a stamp of Hitler, but there was someone else's name, and it was stamped Berlin, 1943. And that, I think, started the whole journey. It absolutely, as you may imagine, terrified me. And I actually ran to my mother that afternoon and said, "You're married to an imposter." She reassured me, and the ID disappeared. So it wasn't until my father died in 2001 that that ID reappeared, that he left me the same box that I had found, but that he left it crammed with clues. So I then traced people in the US, Europe, Australia, Israel, Indonesia, I think, and amassed thousands of documents and pieces of evidence, amongst which were my grandparents' letters that had been snuck out of the ghetto camp of Terezin, just outside of Prague. And I guess it took me about a decade to muster the courage to read those letters, and then another decade to piece it all together. And through the anecdotes and the documents and those letters, I got to know pretty ordinary but pretty fabulous people, friends and family members that I didn't know existed, and many of whom did survive the Nazis. And I suppose the key thing that I piece together, the way the book is framed, is around my father's story, because one of those things that I discovered was how my father survived the war. And you have to imagine this, it's 1943, you're 22 years old, you're a Jew, your parents are in concentration camps, as a matter of fact, most of your family is there, and you have letters, these letters that have been snuck out from the camp saying, do whatever you can, but do not come here. And he's already escaped 2 transports. He's now absconded from a 3rd, and he's hiding in a little room, and he knows the Gestapo are looking for him, and they will come and find him because it's a little room in the family paint factory in Prague. So he knows he has to do something. And he's a bit of a prankster, and he decides that what he's going to do is he's going to fool his persecutors. And how do you do that? You do the craziest thing you can come up with, right? You go and you become someone else, and you travel in 1943 to Berlin, where you then find a job at a factory making lacquers for the Luftwaffe, and you spend 2 years. So I think really that's what my book is about, or that's really what sold my book to the publisher, if that makes any sense. But to me, so the book has these pretty thrilling moments, right? Because my father's life in Berlin is, as you may imagine, pretty horrific, but also pretty thrilling. But for me, the book is much more about having discovered this huge, vibrant, beautiful family I didn't know existed. And it's about my grandparents and their very open, beautiful letters, and how I discovered them, and how I got to know them and love them, and how in telling their stories, really, I have discovered who I am. So I think that's what the book is about.
Thank you so much. I look forward to delving more deeply into those themes. We're going to be weaving in and out of 2 books here. So Peter, I'm going to hand over to you to tell us about your book.
Thank you. Well, I guess there's a kind of very close relationship between your experience as a 9-year-old and mine, because around about that age, I found a document in a desk drawer on which my father's name was written, but obviously it wasn't the name that I was familiar with. I think the distinction between us is that you wanted to be a detective and I wanted to be an England cricketer. But so it took me a bit longer to get to grips with the mystery. Actually, I guess my book was an accidental book. I wrote an article for a little local newspaper in the constituency that I represented at the time. It was a kind of one of a regular contribution to that newspaper, but this one marked Holocaust Memorial Day in 2005, and I wrote a very short 700, 800 word article, which was inspired by a letter that my father had written to his parents when he arrived in this country, or shortly after he'd arrived in this country. This was in 2005. My father died in 2004, and he left a short history of his family. And it was short, and it glossed over a lot of details, particularly in more recent years, but appended to it, as I mentioned, was a long letter written about his first impressions of life in this country when he arrived here on the 10th of May, 1939, after 5 months in Buchenwald. So I wrote this article. It was one of the better ones I'd contributed to the newspaper. I suspect that possibly the editor and I were the only ones that read it. But I was quite proud of it. I thought it was a honest piece of work. But then I forgot about it, or tried to forget about it. And it was fully 10 years later that an image that I'd conjured in this article, which now forms the prologue to my book, an image which I'd conjured kept tugging at my sleeve and telling me I'd started unfinished business. And the image was of 2 trains. The one that took my father west to freedom from Frankfurt South Station, where he said goodbye to his parents, my grandparents. The other which took them east in November 1941 to Latvia, from which they didn't return. So these 2 trains, I say in the book, it's unusual to be kind of haunted by an image that you yourself have conjured, but nonetheless, that's what happened with me. I didn't really know what to do with it. I wasn't thinking about writing a book. In the end, I conceived this idea that I would follow the route that the train which deported my grandparents took to Riga. I don't know what I thought I'd achieve by making that, I suppose, pilgrimage, but that's what I set out to do. And the irony is that it's one of the few things that I suppose ran into the buffers, if you excuse the metaphor. I never did establish the exact route that the train took, because if there were records, I'm sure there would have been records, they'd long been destroyed. And in any event, the train probably wouldn't have kept to the route that was prescribed to it because of munition trains, troop trains going backwards and forward to the Eastern Front. It would have been frequently shunted into sidings and so on. In the end, I did follow an approximate route. Actually, there aren't in the tracks peter out in Poland, so I had to kind of complete the journey in rather comfortable coaches, but nevertheless. But in trying to find out the route of the train, I was almost obliged to ask question after question after question, which reduced ultimately to one question. Why did my grandparents, former friends, their neighbors, the people they did business with, their fellow citizens, why did they put them on that train? And I guess that's, in a sense, what the book ended up being about, trying to tell through the prism of my family's history, through their story, a much broader, longer history. Because when you try to come to an understanding as to why in the mid-20th century, German citizens put other German citizens on trains that took them to their death, you have to go back through the mists of history and start at the beginning, which in the case of my book is in the Bible. And so I've tried to trace through my family's history, and I'm fortunate that there are records of my mother's family that date back to the late 15th century. And they were amongst the first occupants or residents, if that's not too grand a word, of Europe's first ghetto, the Judengasse in Frankfurt. And so I've been able to show through the various adventures and of my family over quite a few centuries the impact of anti-Semitism, prejudice in general, on successive generations, how I suppose in the 19th century they began to think at least that they were overcoming these prejudices at last, only to be confronted with the tragedy of the 20th century. And then because I have political sensibilities, and a lot of my career has been in politics, I felt that if I were writing a book that was simply about my family, I'm not sure that I could have written certainly a better book than Ariana has written, and many other people have written, who felt compelled as second generation, the children of survivors, to write these stories almost as a form of therapy. I felt perhaps I couldn't add to the sum of what's already been very ably documented. But for me, what interests me is not so much conflict between Jews and Gentiles, but the human condition itself. My father posed in his short family history this question that I posed to myself 3 times, I think, in the book. What if Hitler had only persecuted gypsies? What would we have done? I don't know whether he meant what would we Jews have done, or whether he meant what would we Germans, including Jews, have done. But it's an important question. And so it leads me in the end of the book to reflect on what I'd learned in this quest I'd undertaken, but also to try to understand the circumstances in which people, because I don't think the Germans were exceptional in their anti-Semitism. And it certainly wasn't invented by the Nazis, as I've tried to demonstrate, and as everybody anyway knows. But what does it mean for us in the here and now? And, I hope it's not crass to say that some of the rhetoric, as Gary Lineker made very clear quite recently, some of the rhetoric that we hear about asylum seekers, about refugees, is very familiar to those whose families were destroyed or whose immediate family fled Nazi Europe, in my father's case, only to be arrested as an enemy alien and shipped off to Canada for 2 years. And so I think we all have questions to ask ourselves and to answer if we're to understand the present and if we're going to have a better understanding as to how to plot our way forward. So it's a very personal book, but I hope with a public dimension that will mean something to people who want to go a little bit beyond family memoir.
Thank you very much. I think we're getting a really good sense of the individuality of the two books, but also what connects them. And what strikes me as connecting what you both just said was that in your synopses, it sounds so easy as if the material was there. But Ariana, you talk about it being a detective story, and I'm imagining you needed to piece together quite a bit of material, or what was in that famous box that your father left you, and where did you find the other evidence?
So in that famous box, I mean, it took me 10 years of asking questions and going to archives and finding family members in Czech and German, and I don't speak neither. I barely speak English, I have to tell you, especially tonight. So in that box was my father's ID card, and mostly it was his documents from his time in Berlin. I think he was quite keen to prove where he was between 43 and 45, lest anyone thought he had collaborated. So there were quite a lot of books, of documents from his life in Berlin. There was also a letter that my uncle, who had survived the war and remained in Prague during the war, against all odds, had actually written about the family, which is a 5-page letter, which I sort of have here if you want to look at it, and it's translated into English, in case you don't speak Czech like me. I mean, it was quite extraordinary. So I started by doing some research in the Czech archives with a wonderful woman called Magda Veselska in the Jewish Museum there. And she found that I thought my family was 4 people. She found that I had 34 family, my father's generation, really, before the war, there were 34 Neumanns and Hasses. And I started finding their descendants. And incredibly, there were just remarkable coincidences, but I found a cousin, Greg, who works in the post office in San Diego, California. And one of the reasons he works in the post office is because his father was a philatelist. And because his father was a philatelist, he kept all the family letters in his attic. So all of a sudden,
including the letters or the empty envelopes?
Well, at first I thought they were just empty envelopes, but I think he wasn't particularly interested in the letters, but the stamps. But he kept, there was maybe one envelope that didn't have a letter, which he sent, but he could send postcards. And again, I brought some along in case you want to see them. So that helped me piece it all together. And, for me, it was a bit like a mosaic. So I then found lots of documents because, well, at least in Prague, which wasn't bombed, a lot of the documents were preserved during the war. And it was a bit like constructing a mosaic. So you have the family letters, which give you a couple of little clues. And then you have the documents, which also give you clues. But documents can be very unreliable, even though you think they're official documents. For example, there's one which we found, which said my uncle had been imprisoned in February 1945. And it said very clearly, Haft imprisoned, stamped, signed by the official Nazis in charge. And we thought, oh my goodness, the stories are wrong. And I called his daughter and she said, that explains why he was so depressed. And actually, he wasn't imprisoned. And if it hadn't been for some writings that someone else left, I wouldn't have discovered that it was just a ruse to sort of throw the Gestapo off his scent. So all these, I think you have to sort of find all these things. And there were moments where I thought, we've discovered something, and like my uncle was imprisoned. And then you actually realize that that wasn't true. And you need all the tiny little fragments, and sometimes the fragments overlap, and sometimes the fragments are wrong, and you need to figure out where you put them, and then you construct a little bit of a mosaic.
And did the extra boxes that came to light bit by bit help create more questions or create more answers, or both?
I think both. There were definitely, I focused on the answers, but there were lots of, boxes would arrive and you go, how, how is this possible? And often they created answers, and one of them was quite random. I simply contacted the owner of my grandparents' house. My grandparents lived in Prague, but they had an apartment in Prague and a little house in Lipčice. And through Facebook, I found the owner of the house in Lipčice. I had the deed of sale from 1947, so I had the last name. And I found him, and he turns out to be the nicest human being on the planet. No connection to me whatsoever. His grandmother had bought the house. He had lived in it, grown up in it during the communist years with 7 other families. And he had kept, there was a safe when he was a little boy, a safe that was locked. And he dreamt, like I dreamt of being a detective and you dreamt of being a cricket player. He dreamt of the treasure that was locked away in that box. And he opened it finally when he redid the house in 2004, only to find that the treasure was just a bunch of old, actually water-soaked papers because there had been a huge flood. And he kept it, even though it wasn't his treasure, because he figured it might be someone else's treasure. And then in 2017, I came knocking on his door. And I said, can you tell me a little bit about the house? My grandparents lived in that house. I'm writing about it, and I'd love to come and visit. And he said, oh, I can do better than tell you a little bit about the house. I'll send you some documents, which he had restored. And then he sent me the applications of my grandparents to the US consulate in 1939. So the receipts saying that they all wanted to emigrate. But of course, there were quotas, and they never made it.
And Peter, in a book that goes back so far in time, was it genealogy that drove your questions, or were you always looking at those bigger themes of anti-Semitism, relationships between groups of people, sort of social history, really?
I mentioned that my book was an accidental book. When I started drafting it, it was a family history, but it was written, or was being written, really for just domestic consumption, if you like, for my kind of fairly small family in this country. Actually, in the end, I cut out quite a lot of that because, as I said earlier, it would have been relevant only to a small number of people. It's a kind of multi-layered book, and it was very difficult to stitch it all together. I hope in the end it was done with some success, but the impulse I felt was to try to interpret the lives that my family had lived historically, and to see that in the context of always being clients of of more powerful communities around them, and that constant quest from the earliest moments onwards for some kind of stability, some kind of security, some kind of equality, which they achieved, I suppose, fleetingly at the end of the 19th century. And I mean, I tell the story, for example, of Jakob Hertz, Professor Jakob Hertz, who was a professor in the end of surgery, I believe, at Erlangen University, and he was a brilliant student and a brilliant academic, but denied preferment, advancement, promotion because he was Jewish. In the end, he became the first Jewish professor in a Bavarian university, and I believe the first Jew ever to have a statue raised to him in Germany, because he was more than an academic. He ministered to the poor of Erlangen. He'd served the army selflessly, and that's actually how he met his death in 1871. And in 1875, the good people of Erlangen, through public subscription, raised this statue to him in the main square. And then 60 years later, their grandchildren pulled it down. In 1933, they wasted very little time after the Nazis had come to power in tearing down what their grandparents had raised. And I find that a really quite compelling image just at the, just at the moment when German Jews felt that they had achieved what they had struggled for so long, recognition, acceptance, then that fleeting enjoyment of their newfound freedoms and prosperity was dashed from them. Also, I had two photographs, sepia photographs that I had on my kind of wall for some time of some great uncles of mine, Kurt and Oswald. In their military uniforms, they'd served in the First World War. And one of them had little nicks in his face, which I discovered were dueling scars. He'd been at Heidelberg University. I had always thought that this was, he had won great acceptance at Heidelberg University, and the fact that he had these dueling scars showed what a kind of high roller he was. I then read something by, I think she's an academic called Sue, is it Gay or Gray? Gay, I think, who put an entirely different interpretation on it. She said that at the end of the 19th century, as Jews were beginning to be granted new freedoms and rights, they still couldn't get acceptance in German society, and were the victims of quite brutal often and crass persecution. And it may well have been that my great uncle, far from being integrated, assimilated, and as worthy of a rapier scar as anybody else, had actually been defending Jewish honor, because there were Jewish societies and universities that got together specifically to defend their honor in this way. But even then, some of the non-Jewish students felt it was pretty inappropriate to fight a duel with a Jew. So it's that struggle that I find so compelling, and as I said earlier, it keeps taking me back to the question of why. How did people come to think this was acceptable? Why do people feel the need to have these prejudices and to exercise them in the way that they did in the 20th century, and the way that people still do in other societies, Rwanda and Darfur and the endless list? What is it that makes people do these things? Because only when you understand why and how they do these things can you take, it seems to me, the steps necessary to avoid them in future.
Maybe I can go back to something you mentioned in your answer just now, and bring you up to the present, because your book addresses the 21st century, not just everything from the beginning of the church history, really. It goes all the way up to 2020, I think. And mentioning Jakob Herz and Erlangen, there's now a school in Erlangen named after him, and there's a memorial in Erlangen that commemorates not commemorates, but reminds people of the tearing down of the statue. I'm also reminded what you told me about Bamberg Cathedral, and I think it's very clearly described in your book as well, with the picture of the caricature that people are often not aware of, but that you visited. What does all that say about Germany today, about how Germany deals with its history? What does it say about our history, I guess, because you always talk about humanity is not really about one country.
Yes. I spent some, my father, in 2001, 3 years before my father died, my wife and my parents went on a kind of final trip to Germany, and we looked at the places that they had grown up in. And my father took us very proudly to Bamberg Cathedral, which is, if you know Bamberg, if you know it at all, you'll know that beautiful and very historic cathedral. And he showed me all the remarkable things about it, the wonderful statue, the Bamberger Reiter, if you know of it. But he didn't show me something which I subsequently discovered, I suppose, when I visited in 2019, when I was finalizing the book. on the flanking the great ceremonial entrance to the cathedral, the Fürstenportal, the Prince's Gate, are two statues which are quite familiar in the cathedrals, medieval cathedrals in Germany and France. And they're statues of Ecclesia and Synagoga, the church and the synagogue. And they were there flanking Fürstenportal until, I think, 1938, when they were removed because of pollution. And they're now inside the cathedral, but they've been restored recently, and they're outside the cathedral as well. They're both very beautiful, beautiful figures. Synagoga, has to be said, is just as beautiful as the church, except that her head is bowed. She's blindfolded, blind to the truth and glory of the Christian message. And from her left hand are falling the Jewish laws. And this was a message broadcasting into the public square for all to see and for all time, that the church has overcome the synagogue. It's over. The church is triumphant. Now, this was quite remarkable because this was actually erected in 12 something or other, which was almost 1,000 years after the Christian church had indeed triumphed over the synagogue in the time of St. Augustine and the rest. So quite why it was so relevant to put these statues up 1,000 years later in the public domain, I think is very thought-provoking. But and it's quite interesting that these figures have been quite controversial, not least because they were only fairly recently replaced in this public domain. And there have been various meetings between academics and anti-Semitism campaigners in Bamberg with the cathedral authorities in recent years. And I'm told that steps are underway to introduce some kind of interpretation by the cathedral authority to explain the significance and, and maybe, who knows, even kind of apologize a bit for the iconography that is there so apparent. But what is remarkable is that in the cathedral, on the high ceiling above the nave, are two caricatures, one of which I've kind of photographed for the book, which almost nobody knows about. If you Google them, I mean, you can Google anything. Peter Bradley, England cricketer, would probably come up with more than there is about these caricatures, very crude caricatures of Jewish men on the ceiling of the cathedral, with lolling tongues and protruding eyes, staring down at the good Christian folk below. A real contrast to the grace and serenity of the statues outside, which have a kind of faith-based message, but here it's about the here and now. These evil Jews, they mean no good. And as I say, nobody knows about them. There's an American academic who's written just a couple of pages about them, and she based some of what she wrote about a long-dead German academic, but there's nothing else. And even people in Bamberg don't know they're there. I only discovered them through as I say in my book, through the lens, the magnifying lens of my camera. So that was 2019, and I wrote about them in the book. I was in Bamberg again at the end of last year because some Stolpersteine were being, to my father and to my great aunt Meta, were being installed. And it was a wonderful experience, but and very much to the credit of the people who were behind this initiative. But I went back to the cathedral and I discovered that the ceiling of the cathedral had been replastered and these caricatures had been renewed. And there was no explanation anywhere as to how they came to be there 800 years ago, why they've been there ever since, how many times they've been recolored and so on and so forth. And it's a shameful secret. And again, I come back to this theory about understanding the past. I'm full of admiration. I have to admit, I'm now a German citizen. I've taken out German nationality. And I'm full of admiration for the way in which so many Germans have contended with their past, understood it, tried to overcome it. But there are still, in Germany, clearly the Catholic Church that has a great difficulty with embracing the past and dispensing with it. just as in Latvia, there's almost, well, it's very little recognition that the victims of the Holocaust, often at the hands of Latvians, were Jews. If you go to the freight station where my grandparents, along with 1,000 Jews from Nuremberg, were set off the train when it arrived there, there are plaques that commemorate the fact that many Latvians were deported from Riga at this station to Siberia in the time of the Soviets. There's no recognition that 20,000 Jews from Germany and Czechoslovakia and elsewhere came here and died on Latvian soil, often at the hands of Latvians. There's no recognition. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't want to monopolize this, but while we're on this theme, I have a bit of a problem with the Kindertransport, because wonderful though it was for the 10,000 children who survived, you know, they were allowed into this country expressly on the condition that they should not be a burden on the British taxpayer, that they would only be here temporarily, and that their parents should not come with them. And so, you know, although my father didn't come on the Kindertransport, these two trains, my father came here and survived. My grandparents, despite their best attempts to get visas to anywhere that would have them, were denied that refuge, and they perished along with millions of others. And so, you know, comes back to my theme. We need to understand the good things we did, talking as a Brit, but also the good things that we could have done but didn't. And that needs to inform the way we think about things today. And sadly, at the moment, it doesn't seem to.
Very much. I'm going to stay with the theme of places and locations that is so strong in Peter's book and also in yours, Ariana. I got a really strong sense of life in Terezin, or hardship and suffering in Terezin. I think you're unique in having letters that were smuggled out rather than gone through the censored post. We're sitting in an exhibition that tries to showcase the difficulties of communication between people who were deported and their loved ones. And I was wondering if you could tell us your sense of what it was like to have that split in the family between the worry of having somebody in Terezin, maybe even your grandparents' life there. You write very movingly about the protection that was possible from people in the camp who had maybe a little bit more power, but also you showed me a letter that describes the horrific breakdown of sociability, or kind of being together as human beings.
I'm going to find the letter just in case I can read a little bit from it. I think it was my grandfather's letter. I'll look in 1 second. So I don't know if I'm unique. You'd have to ask Professor Hashkova whether I am unique in really having these letters. I think there was quite a lot of contraband going in and out of the camp. I definitely have quite a lot. So I have dozens of letters, and they were coded because you never knew who was going to read them, but they were very open. So for example, my grandparents talk about Bekannte and Roberti, and no one can figure out what they are, but we think they're currencies. So we think they're German marks or Swiss francs, and they talk a lot about the price in the ghetto.
How did you come up with how did you decipher those?
Well, I didn't decipher those on my own, obviously. I mean, as you will know, translating letters, you can't just call up the German embassy and say, or the Czech embassy and say, hey, list of translators, please, because the language has changed so much. I mean, we just have to look back at the last 2 years, or rather 4 years, really. You know, if we had said, I'm isolating in 2017, people would have gone, what? Whereas now it's part of our everyday language. And it was very much the same. So you have to find people that are fluent in the language of Germany in 1940, in the language of the camps, and in an understanding code. And often things, you know, I'm actually working on some letters from Dresden right now, and I'm working with a wonderful translator who works here at the Wiener Library. And there was one of the letters that talks about, it's Dresden 1941, I believe, and the person writing them says, luckily we have a lot of supplies of Coke. And I immediately thought, that's a code for something. And she thought so too. And actually it turns out it's not a code, but America stopped selling the Coca-Cola syrup to Dresden in 1940. So it's tricky to decide. And these people were genuinely happy that they had supplies of Coca-Cola, which is quite remarkable, which goes back to the, it's very odd. These letters are filled with horror, and yet they're so human, right? Where it's just remarkable that with everything that was going on in their lives, somehow the fact that they had Coca-Cola in their basement was something worth mentioning in the letters. But I think it speaks to all our humanity and to how we find little bits of joy in random things. But I thought perhaps I could read you a little bit of my grandparents' letters. And I do have about 60 pages of them. I'm not going to read you 60 pages, but there's one from my grandfather, and it was written in Terezin in the 23rd of December, 1942. I think I'll start just, he always addresses it to my dear ones. My grandmother always addressed it, my dear golden ones. My grandfather was very matter of fact, a little bit pedantic and very strict. So he starts by saying, thanks for your care, which in addition allows me to inform in this manner, because of course he would have received a little parcel with food and probably German marks or Swiss francs. Since I have a free hour today, I want to write a little more extensively. First of all, my heartfelt thanks for the 5th package, which arrived at my address today for the first time. The content of the 4th package, detergent, partially spilled. I think it is possible to send larger parcels. Many of them seem to arrive and are always welcome. Then he goes on to talk about my grandmother and the medical issues. But then he actually describes the conditions in the camp. And this would have been impossible if the letters had been sent by normal means. So Theresienstadt, unlike other camps, inmates were allowed to write. They were allowed to write letters that were 25 words long, and they were read by the censors. Actually, and I have a sample of a letter if you want to look at one later on. My grandparents' letters had 500, 600 words and weren't read by censors, but they were read by the people that snuck the parcels in and out, and who knows who else. But this one, for example, goes on to describe the conditions, which obviously a normal Theresian letter would not have been allowed to do. So he goes, should this numbness continue, I am convinced that I will soon forget how to write or even say my name. Today, I could not recall the name of those I have known for decades. I am writing it so that you understand me when you read my letters. These gentlemen here really managed to turn you into animals. You, normal people, outside will have a very difficult task ahead of you in order to save whatever can still be saved of our humanity upon our return. No one reads or engages in conversation or discussion here. Only bitter arguments about a place in a queue are heard everywhere, even the toilets. All feelings of emotion, sensibility, sexuality have been killed. Women suffer from early menopause. Men are impotent. But all this, it seems, is paradise compared to the alternative in Poland. As you can see, I'm not ecstatic about life here. It only strengthens my longing for a happy home with you. In spite of it all, you must know that I remain convinced that one can survive it. And that is the most important thing. I don't think I need the cyanide anymore. Today, I think I have told you everything that is in my heart. There are about 80 funerals a day here. There are mass burials. I think Jerry, our terrier, was buried better. And he goes on, but that's the kind of letters I have dozens of.
Very starkly with what the Red Cross tried to portray, or was given as an image in 1944 when they visited.
Absolutely. So I mean, Theresienstadt was the sort of model camp. It was very conveniently located so that all the Jews, additionally the Czech Jews, but then the Austrian Jews and the German Jews all transited through there. So it wasn't a traditional death camp with gas chambers. But I believe, and I should look at the numbers, I'm terrible with numbers, but I think over 150,000 people transited through there. And 33,000 people actually lost their lives there, including Peter's great aunt and a great uncle of mine as well. And they died of starvation and they died of disease. So it was a pretty horrendous place, but it was used as a model camp. So you could still, so they had a pretend post office where you sent these letters, and they had pretend currency. So you worked and you got paid. And there was, of course, a hierarchy as well. And I think this is not dissimilar to other camps. You had a council of elders or council of Jewish people who controlled or who decided who was deported and who wasn't. So it was a very complex social structure. And yet you could have a modicum of normality, and if that's a word that you would use in a camp. You had artists painting, and you had people composing. There's beautiful music composed in Theresienstadt. There's beautiful poems. You had children drawing little beautiful things that you can see in the Jewish Museum. So it's a rather odd place. And then in 1944, they decided the Danish took better care of their Jews than, well, certainly than a lot of others, certainly than the Latvians. But in 1944, a bunch of Jews were going to be deported, and the Danish Red Cross insisted on coming by. So the Nazis started this beautification program. And part of the beautification program included planting trees, painting things, giving people sort of nicer clothes, and sending 7,500 people over off to Auschwitz to their deaths, so that they could ease the overcrowding for the Red Cross. And it was all a complete charade. And I believe there were 3 people that went from the Red Cross. And I mean, I think it wasn't Edelstein anymore, but the head of the council in the middle of this had a black eye. I mean, there were obvious things saying this is not what they're pretending it is, which is a sort of a camp for older people, for older Jews to retire to. And yet, you know, people see what they want to see, always. So they miss the details. And they visited, and they said, yes, it's fine. Let's send our Jews. And I mean, it's extraordinary. It was a complete charade. And my grandparents were still there at the time.
Thank you so much. Let's take things further east, as you do, Peter, in your 5th part of your book, which is called Resettlement in the East, and includes the road to Riga, the cleansing of Latvia, and the end game. And those 3 chapters bring the reader up close to the Holocaust in a way that I found almost unbearable to read. And I know that I'm not the only one, but they felt very, very important to read. I have 2 questions about them. The first comes from my astonishment at the detail that you were able to piece together. How did you find that kind of detailed information? And secondly, I kept wondering what it was like for you as a writer to research and write this. Could you tell us a bit about your experience and what you took from it?
Yeah, some of the detail is quite a lot of people ask the answer is that I felt that I had to retain my objectivity as much as I possibly could. I mean, my book is an argument for rationality, for reason. And it's difficult to make that argument unless you yourself retain your reason and you try to be humane, actually, in the way that you encounter these awful deeds. Humane both in your sympathy for the victims, but also to try to understand, as I've said before, how people, ordinary people, as ordinary as the victims, how they come to do these things or to allow others to do them, how the unacceptable can become the norm. And coming to that understanding was very, very important to me and to the purpose of the book. So I did have to steel myself and not get emotionally involved. There are episodes in the book where, which I wrote quite late on, where I actually describe standing in spaces in Bamberg, in Buchenwald, in Latvia, places in which my family had preceded me. And so I do try to give a kind of personal kind of vantage, personal view of where I am and why I'm there. But I thought it was also important to be honest about exactly what happened in Latvia, because lots of people aren't knowledgeable about it and lots of people aren't honest about it, those that know. And I suppose in the public imagination, the Holocaust was about Auschwitz. It's about the gas chambers. And this impersonal kind of killing. Incidentally, one of the points I try to make in the book is that actually there was nothing that happened to, well, there's very little that happened to Jews in the 1940s that hadn't happened to them before. There was very little. If you look at the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, it was a kind of template for the various edicts and laws that were passed against Jews all down the centuries and in the Nazi time as well. The difference was, I guess, the scale of the Nazis' ambition and the technology they had at their disposal to try to implement it. But the gassing, the destruction of Jews en masse in the Auschwitzes and the other places where there were gas chambers was an impersonal act of murder. But in the East, and incidentally, initially my book was called, or at least my working title was Lost in the East, because that's what it says on the memorial to my grandfather in Bamberg. In the East, Jews were murdered by the SS as it followed the German army across Soviet Union, and by Lithuanians and Poles and Latvians and Estonians and others who were their collaborators, and they died by bullets. So my grandmother, for example, 26th of March 1942, was one of 1,700 people who were taken from a camp outside Riga. They were told they were going to be transported somewhere where conditions would be better, they'd have work, they'd be better fed. Actually, they were bussed into the forests around Riga and shot into ditches that had been dug for them by, I think, Russian POWs. But men, I mean, almost, I imagine, exclusively men, some Germans, some Latvians, pulled the triggers. They murdered them one by one by one by one all day, and then the next day and the next day. And I think, one has to be very clear that that is what happened, and that individual men and men collectively and the society collectively was responsible for this. So there is documentary evidence that, from war crimes tribunals. There are documents written by SS officers and others documenting what they did, because at the time they weren't thinking that they were going to lose the war and this might come back to haunt them. So there's a lot of evidence as to what was happening, but very little, as I say, is known about it. And even now, some very credible Latvian historians are great pains to describe precisely what happened, but there are equally great pains to mitigate the guilt that some of their country people should share for what happened. I mean, there's one in particular died quite recently called Andrew Ezegelis, who was based in New York, who was, I think, a very reputable historian. But he, at times, has said, well, we mustn't accept at face value Jewish testimony, the testimony of survivors, because after all, they themselves were duped by the Nazis. They were, this is the way they became victims of the Nazis, not just that they were slaughtered, but they were duped into believing that it was that it was Latvians who were implicated in this. And so I understand, Latvia is a very young country. 100 years since its independence, and for 50 of those years, it's been dominated first by the Soviets, then the Nazis, and then the Soviets again. It has a real challenge to create its own national narrative, and of course, you can see how how collaboration is not a narrative that it wants to tell. But nevertheless, and we see in Poland, for example, legislation which makes it an offense to associate Poles and Poland with what happened on Polish territory during the Holocaust. And this, and closer to home, we see it, sadly, in some reaches of our own politics, radical politics, this inability to understand where some of these ancient prejudices come from and how they are still, vibrant and damaging. As George Orwell said, and he wasn't entirely unfamiliar with anti-Semitism himself. If you read Down and Out in Paris and London, there's some pretty questionable stuff there. But he understood it, and he understood that he, as well as other intellectuals of his time, were subject to it. But he did say that the problem is that the place to start in understanding where anti-Semitism comes from is your own mind. And that's exactly the place where the kind of intellectuals of his acquaintance were not prepared to look. And of course, the other thing that I did in writing that part of the book was to read a lot of survivor testimony and, stuff that should be read, but very, very few people probably have read it. But we owe a huge debt to the people who went through absolute unimaginable hell for year after year after year, survived, and then felt compelled to write down what they had experienced. And so much of what I've written is based on their testimony, trying to understand the lives that, the truncated lives that my grandparents and my great aunts and uncles who were deported to Latvia, how they lived until they didn't live anymore.
Not speak, who could not talk about their stories, and you both talk a lot about the choices we have. And at the same time, Ariana, we were talking about it earlier, there is a real sense of choicelessness being a fact of life in the period that you're both describing. I'm wondering if you could give us all your insights into that relationship between the choices we have that are necessary for us to really confront, and maybe also a little bit of a sense of what it means for us all to be in the human condition, as you said, and be constrained by certain things. What are the constraints? What are our freedoms? What choices do we need to make?
It gives me a little time to think. Thank you. Wow, that's a huge question. I suppose what I tried to do in my book, and my book is much less ambitious, I think, Peter, than yours. It's because, and part of that is because so much has been written about the Czech the Czech Jews, and how much has been written about people that died in Auschwitz and Dachau, which is pretty much my entire family. I tried to focus on a very specific period, on a very small set of people, which were my grandparents and my father's immediate family, and to show really how normal, how inconsequential, I mean, not inconsequential, how sort of unextraordinary they were, and very much how they were very much just like you and me and the person next door. So I actually, what I was trying to do, I think, is show with their story how we all have choices all the time, and how we actually, I think we have these narratives of heroes and villains which we perpetrate with our children, right? Sort of Marvel, you have these superheroes who have capes and who are heroic all the time, and you have villains who are villainous all the time. And actually, I think that's wrong. I think we should realize that we are all heroes and we're all villains, and we all have the ability, actually, to make the right choice. And they're tiny little choices. It isn't just ultimately one thing, I'm going to choose to be a hero. It's just at that particular moment, do I stand up for hatred? Do I stand up? Do I call it out? And perhaps it's all pointless, right? I mean, I often think it is all pointless. But maybe that's why, even if it's pointless, if it's pointless and you just shut up, then nothing happens, right? And maybe you just think, okay, it is pointless, but I should just stand up and just say the right thing. And actually, there's so many people around my family who don't do the right thing, but there's so many who do the right thing. People that take risks. Someone who lends my father his passport, and if he was found out when he was crossing the border into Berlin on May the 3rd, 1943, if my father had been found, he would have been killed, but so probably would have been his Gentile friend Zdeněk, who lent him his passport. And it's just that little moment of Zdeněk could have said no, and who would have blamed it, right? But he said yes. So that moment, he's a hero. And I think that actually is what we need to focus on. We have to be heroes for little moments. And more importantly, we have to make sure that we're not bystanders and that we're not villains, because that's possibly more important. So I'm not sure I answered your question at all, but
very nicely, thank you.
I absolutely with Ariana there. We are all, in all the moments in which we live, we are perpetrators or bystanders or resistors. The choice is ours. That's why I mentioned earlier that I'm now a German citizen. I've got dual nationality. I chose to do that because I believe in reconciliation, partly because actually I believe in continuity as well. And actually, although was born and bred in this country, I'm British, and as the next person, of course, my entire family spent the history that we know about in Germany. So in a sense, I'm reclaiming my German heritage. But choice is absolutely fundamental to what I'm trying to say in the book, that I've just borrowed Sandra's copy, because the very last words I write in it are, "From beneath the indifferent pines of Latvia, my grandfather and my grandmother and all those buried with them cry out, choose reason, choose justice, choose humanity." Because we have choices to make all the time. I was writing the book at the time when the Americans chose Donald Trump as their president, and when, our fellow citizens chose Brexit. And in a sense, that's why I chose to become again a European by becoming a German. It was a symbolic act as much as anything else. But in the book, I talk about the Danes. And it's interesting because there were Danish Jews in Theresienstadt, but actually almost magically, the Danish government, although it was a country in occupation, managed to look out for the Danes who were in Theresienstadt, and there were deaths, but usually through old age or disease, but most of them actually fared rather better than most people in Theresienstadt. But the thing about the Danes, for all kinds of reasons, and I try again to be objective in the book and explain the special circumstances that obtained in Denmark that didn't obtain elsewhere in Latvia, in France, in the Netherlands. The Danes took a decision that when the Germans, the Nazis, decided that they were going to deport the Jewish population of Denmark to the camps, and I think it was in 44 or whatever, the Danes decided almost to a man and a woman this was not going to happen. And they saved their almost entire Jewish community. It was a small community. There were lots of ways in which they had advantages in being able to save them, but that's by the by. They decided there should be no distinction between a Danish Gentile and a Danish Jew. They were all citizens together. And so they managed to hide them. I mean, they got a tip-off that they were about to be rounded up. They hid them in non-Jewish homes, in hospitals, until they could assemble a flotilla to take them across the Öresund to neutral Sweden. And so almost the entire population of Denmark, Jewish population, survived. The Danes decided, they made a choice that other occupied countries did not make. And there were other examples, less perhaps cut and dried, in Bulgaria, in Finland, but the clearest example was Denmark. And had I not, I wasn't aware of it when I started researching the book, and I was so grateful to find that a choice is not just a hypothesis. It is something that actually people can do individually and collectively. And so it's gratifying to see that these people took a risk in Denmark to do the right thing, which is what I've always tried to tell my children. Do the right thing. Don't ask me what it is, just do it. And so I think it was St. Augustine who features in my book. He had kind of rather ambivalent, not entirely favorable views of the Jews. He thought they should not be persecuted unto death because they were part of God's plan. They had to survive long enough to be converted to Christianity, and that was going to be the end of days, and so on and so forth. But he said, do not despair, one of the thieves, do not presume one of the thieves was damned. Do not despair, one of the thieves was saved. And so, it's that idea that there are two trains, there are two choices. There's always a choice, and especially when you live in a democracy, which nominally Weimar was, you have a choice. There comes a critical moment where you make that choice, or you don't make it. You just pretend there's no choice to make, and you become a bystander. But I spent quite a lot of time towards the end of the book looking at, is it Milton Meyer, whose book was quite recently republished? He was an American journalist who before the war had wanted to understand Nazism. He wanted to get an interview with Adolf Hitler, and he didn't get it, not surprisingly. But after the war, he came to the conclusion that the way to understand Nazism was not to concentrate on the bigwigs, but to understand the little people, the kleine Leute. And so he spent time in Magdeburg, I think it was, with 10 former Nazis who were actually pretty unreconstructed even then, to try to understand their psychology as to how step by innocent step, little step by little step, you set out on a path which takes you in the direction that the Nazis took the Germans. And there were people who said, well, we didn't know what was happening. We couldn't see these little steps. I think that's naive and special pleading. I think there is a moment where most people recognize that the next step is the final step. And so, choice, absolutely crucial. Without choice, without being able to make the right choice, life isn't worth living. And I really do believe that it is worth living, and it must remain worth living.
Well, thanks to both of you for making the right choice and writing your books. We've got a bit of time left for questions from the audience. If you've got any, please let us know and we'll get a microphone to you.
How about we collect a couple and then, yeah.
Hi, I'm third generation, and I suppose my question is in regards to, you said that that you worked as a detective trying to find the stories of your family. And my question is, for me, I had a different motivation. I couldn't find anything. So I was motivated by the silences and the absences. And my question, I guess, is that, did you encounter any of these silences or absences when you were looking at what you did with these silences that you found?
Any other questions? Okay, giving me my exercise, thank you.
Well, first of all, thanks for sharing your stories. It fills me with hope and it motivates me also to seek into my own experience, because I think you're blessed to talk about it and to write about it. I'm from a 14th generation Sephardi, so we didn't have access to any information. I mean, we just found out 12 years ago that we were Sephardi Jews in Mexico when my mother had fatty liver disease and we started all the research. But I really like the points you made on the human condition, because now I am Mexican, I am Catholic. We've been Catholic for the last 10 generations. I'm married to an Iranian who maybe their family are not very happy that all the kids are Catholic. So as soon as we feel superiors to others, that's where arrogance and pride can be just so horrible. Like Ariana said, we all become villains, feeling superior, and it all comes out of ignorance. And it can be cheering for a team, but when we feel superior than others, we stop being humans and we stop our purpose of being here. So I think it's a blessing that you have the story to tell, but this is just second generation, third generation. I'm 14th generation. And to be honest, Ariana, your father is a great inspiration. And here comes my question, because what I managed to grasp from your book equals to the sculpture of the physical energy in Hyde Park, where you have the horse with the man looking forward. I think it's based on Erasmus' image made by Albert Dürer much before, where the horseman just has to look forward. And I love what your father did, because I could dig into my history, and I love comparative religion, but I have one life, and how do I spend it properly for my well-being and good of others? So I admire your father's decision to move forward, to give and work, and I'm quite dyspraxic, the way he changed to be a perfect guy, on time, determined, disciplined. But how would you have felt if he was constantly sharing these stories with you? Would you have been different? Have you ever questioned that? Thank you.
Just see if there's any online. No, it's okay, it's okay. Any questions online? No, okay, so why don't we take one more and then.
Questions to both of us, both of you. I think you, Ariana, talked about like getting a box when you were 9 years old and playing detective. How did you feel some way when you got this box? Because I don't think you talked about this. Like just your feelings, or were you too young to get it, or yeah, to understand it, or did you feel anything? Yeah.
Okay, I think that's
Great. So they all actually sort of tie in together, I think. I'm going to address the first one. I grew up with silences. I grew up with shaking hands. I grew up with my father screaming in the night. And actually Peter talks about this beautifully in I forget, but towards the end of the book, about memory and how you move forward, and how at some stage if you're going to live, you have to let go of the past. And I think you quote someone, and I'm being very thick, but you speak about it absolutely beautifully, about sort of moving forward. And I suppose as a second gen, part of the moving forward of my father, and the only way he could cope was to try to erase those memories, at least consciously, not talk about them. And yet that meant that I grew up with huge silences. So for example, I grew up with I have a vast Latin American family on my mother's side. We have, 657 cousins of all sorts. And there's pictures for pretty much every single one of them. And they're colorful, and they're all over. They were all over my beautiful house in Venezuela. And there was only one tiny little picture of my father's family. And it was a really pretty horrid picture of these two people just around a table looking incredibly sad, not looking at each other. It was tiny. And it was the only photograph that there was by his bedside of his parents. So there was a silence there. And whenever I asked questions, there were silences. And I think what I wanted to do, what I felt I needed to do, was fill those silences. And I think, Marcela, when you ask about what I would have done if my father had shared all these things with me, the romantic me thinks, oh gosh, it would have been so wonderful. I wish I had all these stories. I wish I had all these, and I do wish I had all these stories, but I probably in reality would have been a really annoyed teenager and thought, oh God, he's trying to burden me with all this darkness and all this horror. And I'm not sure I would have appreciated the stories. Certainly not when I was, 14, 15, 25. So there's that. And I again, to the third gen in the back who's looking and has encountered silences, I think I'm a storyteller. I'm a big believer in stories. I don't remember numbers. I look at art and I think of the story that they're trying to tell, but I also think of the people that owned it and the stories behind them. And I think there are different ways of filling those silences, and you can fill them with the stories that you uncover in documents, but you can also fill them with your own story. And you can, if you know bits, like you could visit the towns and you could retrace the steps. So a lot of the journey of the closure for me that I got was from tracing my grandparents' steps. And there were a lot of silences I grew up with, and then I encountered a lot of silences and a lot of questions, and I still have many unanswered questions, but a lot of peace and a lot of completeness, I suppose, and a lot of stories. A lot of those silences were filled with my own story, with taking my children to Theresienstadt, who probably felt a little bit like I would have if my father had shared a bit more of his story, right? They just really didn't want to be there because they were, 12, 14, and 16, and it was half term, and everybody else was skiing, and we were running, walking around Theresienstadt with Dr. Hashkova. So I don't know if I've answered. Have I answered all those questions about the box? So when I was 9, I was just terrified. That really is what I remember from it. My father was very old, and I think that scared me too. You know how little kids are scared of older people. I think it, and the different name scared me, and I didn't really know very much, but I knew Hitler was very much a horrible figure, and that scared me. And then I have to tell you that when he left me the box after he died, again, I was scared, because I figured those letters, those documents were just going to take me to a really horrible, dark place, which is why it took me 10 years. And again, I was surprised, and it did take me to really horrific places. And husband, who's sitting at the back with the white hair, can attest to that. I had horrific, really horrific nightmares, and I would wake up screaming over and over and over. And thank goodness he was there, and thank goodness my children were there to remind me of all the light and all the wonderful things. So I was very, very scared. I'd eventually decided, you know what, it's important. It's important for me to go into it. And then I discovered huge, I mean, it's been the best journey of my life, discovering these people and reading these letters. So, so very grateful that I overcame this initial fear and the horror.
I think, you know, silence characterized my family too, and I think it's a very common phenomenon in those kinds of households. I was kind of saying in the book, when I tried to kind of understand why my father in particular never spoke of these things, that, you know, if you'd lived through them, why would you want to recall them? Why would you want to live through them again, particularly when you were trying to build a new life and put behind you traumas that you couldn't resolve. His parents were not going to come back, were not going to be restored to him. So he didn't speak of these things. And yet, when my mother died in 2004, in 2010, and my sister was clearing the house, she came upon a trunk, you know, the magic trunk that I don't think either of us knew existed. It was in a kind of cupboard under the stairs. And she gave it to me because she was living in Australia. And I didn't open it for some time, but when I did, I found my father's talus and his holy books, which was remarkable because he was not, I mean, he was almost militantly un-Jewish, almost at the point at times of being anti-Jewish. He was very anti-religion, and yet he had kept these memories of the past. And underneath these religious artifacts and his regimental insignia from when he was finally allowed back from Canada to join the British Army, there were the best part of 700 letters. Most of them actually were written between my father and my mother on a daily basis when he was stationed in India. Almost like a WhatsApp group, but with stamps. So there were 700 letters that revealed a relationship which I frankly didn't recognize. By the time I came on the scene, I think it had changed a bit. But anyway, but there were also, I think, 35 letters from my grandparents to my father. So from, you know, when they were captive in Germany, in Bavaria, desperately trying to get out, but not succeeding. And they were writing to him when he was in London. And then when the war broke out, ironically, he could still receive their letters in his internment camp in Canada. And the letters were increasingly, well, they were, you know, hopeful and then dejected and finally resigned. So he kept all these things. Perhaps he couldn't bring himself to destroy them. I can understand why that would be. Perhaps, you know, maybe even subliminally, he intended for us, his children, to find them. And I'm sure Ariana asked the same question of, you know, herself as she was researching and writing. You know, do we have a right to intrude on these private histories of our grandparents, our parents? And I think in the end, you know, I was conscious from time to time that I was exploiting, you know, this was kind of this, you know, misery lit or whatever it's called that you see in bookshops these days. And I was conscious and wary of it. But then I thought, as I read you those last words of the book, that somehow my grandparents, who probably couldn't make sense of what they were living through, would perhaps ask me to find a reason, to find some, salvage something to make meaningful the lives that they had sacrificed, or their lives had been sacrificed on their behalf, to find some way of restoring their humanity and to making of it a message, a hopeful message to the world. And so, you know, I don't want to get fanciful or whimsical about this. It's not what would have been occupying their minds when they went to their graves, but nevertheless, I found a great succor in through their lives and the lives of others, trying to make this point about choice, trying to make this point about despair, but hope, and our duty to embrace hope.
Thank you. I think that seems like a good place to stop. And we're really pleased that you did, and both of you did this and went on this journey and to write these books. So we also have a little bit of time after if you'd like to purchase them, if you don't have them yet for your collection. And just leaves it to me to thank the three of you for this wonderful conversation and to thank all of you for joining us and all of you to joining online. Thank you again.